Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 2015 Don Aitkin Lecture, to be delivered by Laureate Professor John Dryzek. My name's Stephen Parker. I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the University. I'd like to welcome, in particular, Emeritus Professor Don Aitkin and Beverly Aitkin. And I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, who are the traditional owners, custodians of the land on which we're meeting. I pay my respect to their elders past and present, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. I would like to acknowledge the presence of some council members, Sue Salthouse, Sarah Ryan, Chris Folks, Katja Mikhailovich and Anita Smith. Thank you for coming to this. This lecture series is in honour of Don Aitkin's service as Vice-Chancellor of the University between 1991 and 2002. Don is an historian, political scientist and novelist. He's been a noted public intellectual in Australian life since the 1960s. He was Professor of Politics at Macquarie University in the 1970s, and then Professor of Political Science in the Research School of Social Sciences at the ANU. In 1988, he was appointed the Foundation Chairman of the Australian Research Council, and it was from this position that he joined the University of Canberra in 1991 as Vice-Chancellor. He was best known at UC for his role in the transformation of the university from a college of advanced education, developing a unique identity and profile nationally and internationally across a wide range of endeavours. The series began in 2005 with the inaugural lecture, which was delivered by Don himself. The intention is that these lectures are delivered by prominent Australian and international scholars who bring to bear their research and insights on major contemporary social, scientific and cultural issues. They bring to the university distinguished scholars, artists and critics for discussion, debates, seminars and workshops, and they enable a variety of interactions with staff, students and the Canberra community. There are few who better fit the bill than this evening's lecturer, Professor John Dryzek. John is Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow and Centenary Professor in the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the Institute for Governance and Policy Analysis here at the University. Before moving to us, he was Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Australian Research Council Federation Fellow at the ANU. He's a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, former Head of Department of Political Science at the University of Oregon and the University of Melbourne, and of the Social and Political Theory Programme at ANU. He's a former editor of the Australian Journal of Political Science. Working in both political theory and empirical social science, he's best known for his contributions in the areas of democratic theory and practice and environmental politics. One of the instigators of the so-called deliberative turn in democratic theory, he's published 5 books in this area with Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press and Polity Press. John's work in environmental politics ranges from green political philosophy to studies of environmental discourses and movements to global climate governance. And he's published 5 books in these areas with Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press and Basil Blackwell. His presence at UC is a sign of our development into a mature, world-ranked university which prizes equally transformative teaching and high-quality research that makes an early and important difference to the world around us. John's lecture is entitled, "Do People Get the Government They Deserve?" I'm in enough trouble already, so I won't comment further on this intriguing topic. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the 2015 Don Aitkin Lecturer, Professor John Dryzek.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you everyone for coming. It's certainly an honour to be giving this lecture named after Don Aitkin, who is a fellow political scientist, and he also, like me, moved from moved to the University of Canberra from the university that's on the other side of Black Mountain. For me, the move has been nothing but positive, that the University of Canberra and the Institute for Governance and Policy Analysis in particular provide a great environment for me and for the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance. So just really, really pleased to be here. Now, in this talk, I will eventually get round to saying some things about deliberative democracy, but it may take a while. And when I do, I should recognize a contribution to anything I might say from all my colleagues in the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance, a number of whom are in the audience here. Also, I should recognize that we're embedded in a much broader global network of scholars in this area, many of whom have passed through the Centre at various times over the past few years. And I should recognize the contributions to my own thinking of all those people as well. Now, it's often said that a week is a long time in politics. Just over a week ago, I thought I had this lecture finalized, and I knew that I was going to say. Everything, of course, changed after the momentous events surrounding leadership transition in the nation's capital last week. I refer, of course, to Stephen Parker announcing that he was going to step down as the University of Canberra Vice-Chancellor next year. And I think we may have got a different Prime Minister last week as well. Anyway, an obvious approach to the question, do people get the government they deserve, will be to start with this government. Of course, this particular government is only a few days old. A week ago, I might have said, surely nobody deserves this government, a government that seems to be in some trouble. Of course, different people might have different reasons. For example, that, does anyone deserve a government that is a wholly owned subsidiary of the mining industry? Where at least we have an opposition that is only a partially owned subsidiary of the mining industry, so at least we have a choice. Does this still hold? Well, hard to tell at the moment. But anyway, it would be too easy to start with cheap shots like that at the current state of Australian politics, so instead I'm going to start with Joseph de Maistre. Who was he? He was actually the first person to say something like the title of tonight's lecture. He said, he didn't say the people gets the government it deserves. He said every nation gets the government it deserves in an 1811 comment on some new constitutional laws in Russia. Now, who was de Maistre? He was an arch-conservative. He helped define continental European conservatism as it was mainly practiced in the 19th century. He thought aristocracy was the eternal law of nature. He favored absolute monarchy, and he believed in the temporal political authority of the Pope. For de Maistre, constitutions, or good constitutions, came in the end from God and could be perfected by man, but came in the end from God. So it was a very kind of rigid and unbending form of conservatism. It's often contrasted with the kind of conservatism that developed in Great Britain under the influence of his, well, near contemporary, actually, he was writing several decades earlier, Edmund Burke, who founded a much more evolutionary, accommodating, and as it turns out, brilliantly successful kind of conservatism, which flourishes to this day in Britain. John Howard once declared himself a Burkean conservative and a follower of Edmund Burke. I think Tony Abbott has more than a whiff of Joseph de Maistre about him, and that perhaps explains his demise. Okay, so what did de Maistre mean when he said that every nation gets the government it deserves? First, his invocation of the nation should not go unnoticed. There was a time when monarchs and their apologists didn't need to invoke the idea of a nation. Really, the idea of the nation only begins with the French Revolution, so 20 years or so before de Maistre was writing. For that matter, the idea of the people only really begins with the French Revolution. Before the French Revolution, before 1789, the people, if it meant anything at all, meant the common people as opposed to the aristocracy, the nobility, and possibly the clergy. So 1789 then was a good year for the people. It was, of course, the year the French Revolution began. It was also the year of the US Constitution, whose preamble begins, "We the people." So really, but before that, the people as an encompassing whole didn't feature in political discourse at all. So what did de Maistre mean when he said that every nation gets the government it deserves? I think it's really by way of saying that things are already perfect, essentially. Don't change them. Every nation has got the government it deserves, so no change is needed. And this really underpinned his unbending, rigid kind of conservatism, which really did end mostly in tears and revolution for the politicians who followed it in the 19th century. The claim, de Maistre's claim that every nation gets the government it deserves is actually historically problematic, or at least a bit circular, because most nations are actually the product of states rather than vice versa. So it's not as though nations create their governments. Governments often create nations to go with them. So state building, nation building is a hard and strenuous task, as we see from the history of Europe, from places like Italy, Germany, and much later on in places like Indonesia. State building, nation building are hard tasks. So to say that, and they're often initiated by governments. So to say that every nation gets the government it deserves when nations are often the product of governments is actually a bit circular. Now, de Maistre himself served the state of Piemonte, Sardinia, which, as it turned out, never did manage to get a nation attached to it. So it was not, in retrospect, a very successful nation-building enterprise that he was involved in. Okay, so de Maistre was associated with an authoritarian era. What I'd like to do now is move into more clearly democratic territory. Now, the most common interpretation of the statement that people get the government that they deserve may now be that people can be blamed for their bad governments and credited for their good governments. If there's a bad government, it's the people's fault for not doing anything about it. Now, the person who's often credited with the statement that in a democracy people get the government they deserve is Alexis de Tocqueville, 19th century French political thinker, most famous perhaps for his book on democracy in America, but also a French conservative politician. Actually, that attribution is almost certainly wrong. It's not clear who first used the term, in a democracy people get the government they deserve, but it did become part of political discourse in the United States, in particular in the late 19th century, and is invoked frequently in the US and beyond by different people since then. So it did come into general use in the late 19th century, perhaps as befits an emerging democratic age. Its actual origins are a bit obscure. They're maybe decentralized and democratic themselves. So it became a widely held maxim, but it's true. But is it true? It contains a bit of an ambiguous mixture of moralizing and seemingly factual statements, so it's actually a bit slippery when it comes to trying to decide if it's true or false. I will eventually conclude that it's actually a claim that is very hard to sustain. I'm going to argue towards that position by suggesting that we can apply a few bits of social science and political theory to help determine the veracity or otherwise of the claim. Now, to start with a bit of clarification, the government in this statement could mean one of two things. It could mean the government of the day, this government, so say the Turnbull government that we now have in Australia. Or it could mean the system of government that we had. So both of those meanings are entirely possible. Let me suggest that when it comes to the system of government we have, it is very hard to hold the people responsible, and so very hard to say that people deserve the system of government that they have. This is due to the idea of path dependency, to use a bit of social science, which comes from the subfield of historical institutionalism. Path dependency means institutions that are largely, not necessarily completely, but largely the product of their own past. So people rarely get to choose the institutions under which they live, and that includes the institutions of government. Path dependency means that early decisions constrain later ones because the cost of changing course is high. Actors develop material stakes in the institutions that dominate society. So, for example, existing politicians, who are the people who make policy, have prospered within the system as it currently exists, and so they have all kinds of incentives to keep it that way. Institutions can arrange feedback that reinforces their own necessities. So think of the institutions many of the institutions of global finance, big banks and so forth, which were in 2008 were described as too big to fail. I mean, that kind of feedback was organized by the institutions themselves. The ideas and norms that institutions generate to support themselves can take on a life of their own and solidify the path that the institution is on. So what that means is that suboptimal and perhaps even failing institutions can persist for a long time. Actually, the classic example of of path dependency is not really from an institution. It's the QWERTY keyboard that we're all used to, that was originally designed as a way to slow people's typing down, to stop the keys from jamming on manual typewriters. And that's what we have on computer keyboards today, even though it's much more inefficient than other alternative layouts of the characters on a keyboard. Okay, not all institutions are equally path-dependent. Some feature a degree of reflexivity, which means they can change themselves in response to changing circumstances. Elsewhere, I've argued that specifically ecological reflexivity can now be thought of as the first virtue we should seek in social and political institutions in response to the kind of unstable environmental epoch that the Earth system is entering, as indicated by climate change, but by global environmental change more generally. But that's really another story altogether. And so, although that's going to be something of a preoccupation in the coming years, that's not really part of this lecture. Now, of course, path dependency means good institutions can persist as well as bad ones, but their persistence is not necessarily due to their goodness. If people do happen to inherit good institutions, it's not because they've deserved it, because they do not actually get a free choice concerning that institution, those institutions. It's really a matter of their good fortune, not anything they've necessarily done to deserve. Path dependency also means that in a democracy, people do not actually get a free choice concerning the character of the range of options presented to them, especially at election time, even if they get a choice across these options. I'm going to illustrate this with some things that Bronwyn Bishop said in a Q&A program earlier this year while she was still speaker. The program was billed as celebrating 800 years of Magna Carta. In that program, Bronwyn Bishop said that the reason we have a two-party system is because people disagree about politics. Some people, like her, believe in individualism and free enterprise. Other people believe in collectivism, and that's why we have a two-party system. As a fellow panelist, Luca Belgiorno-Nettis, who's also head of the New Democracy Foundation, pointed out, these fossilized ideologies hardly exhaust the range of conceivable options, but they've at some point been ingrained into our system, and we're stuck with them today, even though if we were starting from scratch, those might well not be the two main options that we chose. So they're fossilized into the system of government. The range of options they present is path dependent. When it comes to an issue like climate change, which I've done a lot of work on, the adversarial system has some particularly pernicious consequences. This system processes the climate change issue through an adversarial lens. As such, climate change becomes just another arena for point scoring in the interests of partisan advantage. And a belief in the reality or not of climate change becomes a mark of political identity. So this is fortunately true, actually it's true most of all in the United States, where conservative Republicans, it's a mark of identity to deny the science of climate change. On the other hand, if you're a liberal Democrat in the US, it's a marker of identity to believe in it. Fortunately, this equation is only true in the US and to a degree in Canada and Australia, much less true elsewhere in the world. But it means we do get hung up on, for example, the question of whether climate change exists or not becomes a partisan question, which it really shouldn't be. It would be a much more intelligent democracy would start from this kind of a starting point which asks, how do we act in complex social ecological systems we do not fully understand, but where we know that catastrophic change accompanying state shifts is at least a possibility? Democracy at its best, as the American philosopher John Dewey once argued, at its best it's a form of collective inquiry. When dominated by a fossilized adversarial system in which everyone talks and nobody listens, let alone reflects, the aspiration is hard to achieve. Now, before we leave Bronwyn Bishop, she also said in that Q&A that the first task of government is to ensure the security of its people. This was actually a strange thing to say in the context of commemoration of the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta, which was, of course, all about limiting executive authority and arbitrary power, rather than justifying more extensive power on the grounds of the need to protect the people. If I were casting a pantomime of Magna Carta, I think I would cast Bronwyn Bishop as Bad King John. Yeah, actually, I'm not, okay, that's, Bronwyn Bishop is on the left there. Anyway, path dependency means that the idea that people get the set of options and institutions they want or choose is actually incoherent. The idea that people get the institutions they deserve is therefore equally incoherent. Unless perhaps we conceive of the people as an entity that has a collective persistence over time, whose past members perhaps once did have meaningful choices, and so in the sense of, in the intertemporal sense, we might actually share in those choices. Okay, setting aside that kind of problem, let's assume people collectively really do have a meaningful choice at election time. If people then get the government they deserve, that presumably assumes that they actually get the government that they choose. But does this actually happen? Think of the election to the UK Parliament held earlier this year, where David Cameron's Conservative Party won a majority of the seats in the House of Commons based on 36.9% of those who voted. The turnout in the election was 66.1% of eligible voters. The electorate. The electorate was 72.3% of the population. So that doesn't include children, non-citizens. Which means that 17.6% of the people who lived in the UK actually voted for the Conservative Party. So what does it mean to say the people of the UK deserve their Conservative government when only 17.6% of them voted for it? Of course, proportional representation plus compulsory voting might improve those numbers a bit, but they still wouldn't change things entirely. I should also note in this context moves underway, especially in the United States, to narrow what we mean by the people, rather than broaden the basis for the support of government. Here we see the Republican Party in particular, in the states it controls, engaging in efforts of voter suppression to try and make it harder for low-income and ethnic minority groups to vote. For example, making it harder to register to vote by having demanding ID requirements for when a vote is cast, closing down polling stations in areas populated by ethnic minorities, denying the vote to anyone with a criminal record, or even, as it turns out, the same name as somebody with a criminal record, and making it harder to cast early ballots before Election Day, which low-income and ethnic minority voters tend to do more so than higher income and white voters. Of course, it's harder here to do something like that. Fortunately, we have an independent electoral commission, and for that matter, compulsory voting, which make that kind of voter suppression very difficult. But so it's simply worth noting that that's an attempt to sort of, in some sense, sort of narrow and redefine what the people actually means in practice. Although the Republicans who engage in that don't justify it in those terms. They claim that what they're doing is eliminating the possibilities of voter fraud, but that's pretty transparent justification that really doesn't convince. Okay, so let's set aside all these kind of problems and assume that a government is elected that the people both want and deserve in some moral sense. Matters will not necessarily stay that way in terms of what the government actually does. Governments will not necessarily do what the people want. Okay, consider in this context the government of Greece. So the Syriza party won an election earlier this year, and that's actually just won another one a couple of days ago, on an anti-austerity platform, one that rejected the medicine as prescribed by international institutions, including the EU and the IMF. Syriza, in power, found that it couldn't follow the policies that it was elected on. Okay, that it was just too constrained by those international institutions and by international markets to follow those kind of anti-austerity politics. This is actually an extreme illustration of what all governments in capitalist democracies face all the time. That they're constrained by imperatives generated in the transnational capitalist political economy. There are things no government can do for fear of spooking the markets and or powerful transnational economic institutions like the IMF. So as American political scientist Charles Lindblom argued several decades ago, the market is actually a kind of prison when it comes to policy making and government. It really sort of constrains and limits what governments can do. So even governments elected, as Syriza was, on a left-wing anti-austerity policy, find that in practice they can't pursue it. So does any people deserve a government that is imprisoned in Lindblom's terms? Clearly not, I would say. So anyway, the claim that people in a democracy get the government they deserve is hard to sustain. People often don't get the kind of government policies they either want or deserve in a positive sense. So what can we do about it? There's no obvious solution, but there are some things that might help. So here again, I'm going to take my bearings from the US political philosopher John Dewey, who said once, quite famously, that the cure for the ills of democracy is more democracy. In particular, democracy has to involve more than just occasional voting in national elections. And so this is where deliberative democracy enters. Now, I could talk for hours on ideas people associated with the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance and the broader deliberative democracy community have generated for improving democratic politics, ranging from better accountability mechanisms connected to international negotiations, to using citizens' juries to generate principles of international law, to connecting citizen forums with parliamentary committees. There's just a host of innovations which have been explored and in some cases followed through on. Instead, I'll pick out just two modest proposals with which I've been associated in the past few years. The first is going to start with Edmund Burke, who I mentioned before. Edmund Burke, in his famous 1774 speech to the electors of Bristol, which is widely regarded as one of the sort of foundational documents of conservatism, said that Parliament is a deliberative assembly. This proclamation didn't necessarily do him much good. The speech was just after the 1774 election. In 1780, he lost his seat. It's often said that the people of Bristol turfed him out, but that's actually not quite true. That he saw he was going to lose and withdrew from the election. However, the electors of Bristol have, over the years, often shown some famously bad judgment. Some of them support really bad football teams. I'm surprised I didn't get a comment from the front row. Today, I think we can find more Bristol Rovers supporters in Canberra than we do in Bristol, perhaps. But Burke, I think, only got Parliament half right in that quote that I just gave. Deliberation features both justification and reflection. What does this mean? Deliberation is in part about talking, about communicating, about justifying positions and proposals. But it's also about reflection. It's about listening. It's about being willing to change one's mind in response to what one hears. Now, we do have some empirical results generated especially by my Swiss colleague André Beichtiger, his students and co-authors, which suggest that justification and reflection are often not found in the same place. In parliaments, legislators rarely change their minds in response to the arguments they hear from the other side. So parliamentary debate in particular on the floor of Parliament is often more of a ritual performance in which people are talking past each other. If you look at the level of justification, given the reasons that people give for the positions they hold, the level of justification is often quite high. But the level of reflection and respect shown for speakers on the other side is generally quite low. Essentially, people don't listen. They only listen with partisan advantage and point scoring in mind, rather than reflecting on what has been said by the other side, let alone sort of changing their own position as a response. Now, the situation is actually more or less the opposite when it comes to citizen forums, which deliberative Democrats have experimented with a lot in recent years, composed of non-partisan lay citizens. There, we find that the level of justification is actually quite low, but the level of reflection is quite high. Think of juries in the criminal justice system. We have, in a jury trial, we have essentially two chambers. We have a chamber of justification, the courtroom itself, where advocates make arguments, And then we have a chamber of reflection, where the jury reflects upon those arguments and ultimately, of course, sort of makes a decision about the guilt or innocence of the defendant. Now, in this light, in a system like a political system like Australia, and especially the federal parliament, but this is true even more so of the United States, we have two houses of justification and no house of reflection. Upper houses were often instituted as houses of review, but in practice, the Senate in both the US and in Australia really don't operate in that manner. They operate in pretty much the same way as the House does. So we have two houses of justification. There are exceptions in the Senate. Actually, my favorite exception is Senator Ricky Muir. I think, at least as far as I can tell, he may be the best senator when it comes to the deliberative virtue of reflection. Why? Because he got there by a process which involved a high element of randomness. Now, people make fun of the fact that he's not very good at making arguments. His first televised interview was widely seen as something of a train wreck. Although I think he has improved with time and actually has given the occasional decent speech to the Senate. But even if he gave no speech at all, I think he would still get my own nomination as Backbench Politician of the Year, precisely because of his virtue when it comes to reflection. That what he does is when a policy proposal comes his way or a piece of legislation that he needs to vote on comes his way, he thinks, well, how does this affect the average Australian, people like himself, because he's a very average and a very ordinary Australian. So I think he exhibits a particular kind of deliberative virtue, the virtue of reflection, which really ought to be much more widespread in Parliament, and in the Senate in particular, if it's really sort of doing its job as a house of review. So, apart from electing people more like Ricky Muir, what could we do? We do have experience with chambers composed up of randomly selected citizens, which, as I've suggested, might do a better job when it comes to reflection than elected partisan politicians do. And so I think there's a case for increasing the role of these things in democratic systems. Currently, the deliberative citizen forums, like citizens' juries, like citizens' assemblies, are often seen as feeding in to parliamentary processes in particular. But that may actually be thinking of them in the wrong place. Instead, they should be reviewing parliamentary decisions and deliberating them. So this is the Australian Citizens' Parliament, which I helped organise back in 2009. These are the participants, the 150 citizen participants, one from each federal electoral district, standing on the steps of Old Parliament House. So when I show this slide, I always say, well, these people actually look like Australia. If you took a picture of the 150 members of the House of Representatives, they do not look like Australia. Okay? And their social characteristics are not representative of Australia as a whole in the way that these people are. So it's representation, but in a different sense. The most radical suggestion along these lines was made by the Demos think tank in the UK in the context of House of Lords reform in 1998, where in a pamphlet called the Athenian option, they suggested that the House of Lords be replaced by a citizens' assembly working along these kinds of lines. This is not the only way of thinking about a chamber of reflection. Arguably, our constitutional courts, such as the US Supreme Court in particular, are supposed to be chambers of reflection. Often they don't do their job. The Supreme Court, US Supreme Court today, divides along predictable partisan lines, and so it's clearly not doing its reflective job properly. But if we wanted to experiment with this idea, well, we could do it in currently unicameral systems that don't have an upper house. We have one close at hand. The ACT government does not have an upper house. Nor does Queensland, nor does New Zealand, nor does Nebraska. Globally, there is a campaign for an elected United Nations Parliamentary Assembly, which has gained some traction internationally. Bob Brown in Australia is probably the most well-known person who's signed up to it. I don't think an elected global parliament is at all feasible in any foreseeable future. For different reasons, it would be opposed strenuously by China, he certainly wouldn't want elections to a global parliament happening in China. It might give people ideas about elections to a Chinese parliament. And the US, which would not easily recognize any elected body potentially superior to the US Congress. I think it would be possible to institute something like this globally. It would be it'd be a struggle, but it would be more straightforward to actually introduce something like this within the United Nations system than it would be an elected UN Parliamentary Assembly. Okay, if you think these kind of proposals are far-fetched, well, the idea of a citizen chamber as an upper house is favored by Luca Belgiorno-Nettis, who chairs the New Democracy Foundation, which I mentioned earlier, who actually co-funded the Citizens' Parliament. Lucy Turnbull is on the research committee of the New Democracy Foundation, and she's married to the Prime Minister. So there aren't too many degrees of separation to go from this proposal to the Prime Minister, although I don't expect a constitutional amendment to replace the Senate with a citizens' chamber anytime soon. Okay, so that's one idea. Second idea is discursive representation. It's based on the idea that we can think not just about representing individuals in processes of government, but we can also think about representing discourses. Such as, I've done a lot of work in the environmental area, so sustainable development is a discourse, so is green radicalism, so is market liberalism. So we can think of we can actually think in terms of representing discourses as well as individuals, which is how we normally think of in terms of representation. So I actually argued for this with my colleague Simon Niemeyer in an article that's published in the American Political Science Review a few years ago, just called Discursive Representation. Actually, before I get into the argument for discursive representation, I'll just interrupt this lecture with a trivia question, which is, actually there's two parts to the question. One is, how many Australians associated with the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance have published articles in the world's leading political science journal, the American Political Science Review? And the second part of the question is, how many Australians not associated with the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance have published articles in the world's leading political science journal, the American Political Science Review. Those two questions actually have the same answer, and the answer is 4, at least to the best of my calculation for each of them. So we do as well in our little centre as the rest of Australia does. Okay, but that's a bit of a digression. What's discursive representation and why should we do it? Now, according to discursive psychology, the individual exists at the intersection of a number of discourses. In requiring that the individual choose, say, who to vote for, some aspects of the self, of the discursive self, need to be repressed. Okay, just to illustrate this, let's go to elections in the US. Why do working class whites in the United States vote overwhelmingly for Republican candidates who promote policies that are overwhelmingly against the material interests of those working class whites? Which as a result, well, part of the result, it means that over the decades, those ordinary working class whites their living standards have really slipped in a major way. So why do they keep on voting for Republican candidates whose policies have a lot to do with why their own material interests have been suppressed? The reason has little to do with economics and material interests. Instead, it's due to cultural factors, often summarized as being the 3 Gs, guns, gays, and Jesus. So that's the so it's for cultural reasons they vote the way they do. They get a lineup of they vote for people like this. These are all the Republican candidates for president, although I think one of them, Scott Walker, just dropped out. They're not all clowns. Actually, the person second on the right is the only one that I've met in person, is John Kasich, who is now governor of Ohio. When I taught at Ohio State University a long time ago, he was a young member of Congress, but also a graduate of the department that I taught him, so I had him come along and teach one of my classes. I thought he was a very nice person, but extremely right-wing. His opinions haven't changed much since then, but now he's probably the most moderate candidate in this field. Anyway, in pondering those sorts of voting patterns that I just remembered, It sort of reminds me a bit of what the US journalist H.L. Mencken once said about democracy. He said, democracy is the theory that the common people know what they want and deserve to get it good and hard. So working class whites in the US do indeed get what they choose, what they seem to want, good and hard. Their material interests get hurt, their incomes decline. Though oddly enough, it may actually be a good thing that that they're actually sort of moving to, well, as this lineup suggests, the Republican voters seem to be moving still further to the right as they wind themselves up in a process that Cass Sunstein identifies as group polarization. It actually makes it more likely that that in the primaries they will select candidates who will lose to Democrats, which paradoxically would then be in the material interests of Republican voting white working class voters. So it's a kind of a paradoxical mechanism, although the difference that actually makes their well-being may in the end be a bit marginal. Okay, what would discursive representation mean? It would mean that a right-wing cultural discourse, the three Gs, could be represented, as well as an economic discourse that embodies the material interests of working class whites. So it would be sort of, in a sense, sort of breaking individuals down into their constituent discourses and representing the discourses rather than treating the individual as an integrated whole who then votes. So how exactly do we represent discourses? There are lots of ways of thinking about it, most easily not in connection with the interests of electoral democracy. Discursive representation already happens informally. So environmental groups might represent a discourse of sustainable development. The Institute of Public Affairs represents a discourse of market liberalism. This is all done informally. They're not formal elected representatives, but they are, in a sense, making representative claims in the political system. Okay, one particularly well-known discursive representative who appears all the time in the literature when discussions of discursive representation and other forms of non-electoral representation are made is Bono. Partly because of one famous claim that he made. I represent a lot of people in Africa who have no voice at all. They haven't asked me to represent them. So what kind of representation claim is this? I think it makes most sense in terms of he actually doesn't represent people. He represents a discourse of Africa, which represents Africa, which constructs Africa in a particular kind of way, as having claims upon the charity of the rich, but not much in the way of agency on the part of individual Africans. Okay? And that is controversial, to say the least. And that's where the Make Bono History campaign comes in. These are people who reject his discursive representation claims. Of course, that's not the way they put it, but that's the way I interpret it. So that's informal discursive representation, and we can actually analyze the representation claims of Bono in a deliberative systems light. I mentioned papers published in the American Political Science Review by people associated with our center. Well, the latest one, which is forthcoming, is by John Kuiper, who was a PhD student here, currently on a postdoc at Stockholm University, and it is actually on the claims of non-electoral representatives, interpreting them and evaluating them in a deliberative systems light. More formally, I talked about the idea of a citizens' chamber earlier, a few minutes ago. It would be possible to identify subsets of the people in that chamber on the basis of their identification with particular discourses, and select them on that basis for participation in, for example, committees to deliberate particular bills. So it would be possible to formalize discursive representation. I know this sounds like a radical proposal, but I think there are ways of justifying it in deliberative terms. So these are just a couple of ideas. If you don't like them, I have plenty of others, but I don't really have time to talk about them. Certainly these sorts of ideas and reform suggestions won't guarantee that people actually get the government they deserve in some positive sense. But they may make it less likely that people get the kinds of government that they certainly don't deserve. The whole impetus of deliberative democracy is to think of ways of deepening democracy in communicative terms rather than being satisfied with a relatively thin electoral democracy that we have at the moment. I conclude that people may sometimes get the government they deserve, if we think of government as a punishment for bad judgment, but that's perhaps, even that's a bit unfair. But most of the time, there are mechanisms in place that mean that people's judgment is not as consequential as it should be, and so it is wrong to blame them. So in that sense, people don't get the governments they deserve, in either the negative sense of being punished for their bad judgment, or the positive sense of the ones that they actually merit, and almost certainly never will. But people do deserve better, and there are ways of thinking about that. Okay, I'll finish there.